December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft dropped toward Pearl Harbor, history fixed its attention on the battleships, on Arizona burning, Oklahoma capsizing, fighters exploding on the runways. Yet while the world would later remember those images, the Japanese attack planners had identified a very different priority. Moored quietly around Oahu were the most methodically hunted targets of the morning: the flying boats. Of the 81 PBY Catalina stationed on or near Hawaii that day, 73 were destroyed. 7 survived only because they happened to be airborne. Just one remained intact at its mooring, untouched by strafing fire, almost by accident. The destruction was so complete that it appeared deliberate. It was. Japanese pilots had been ordered to destroy the Catalinas wherever they found them. Not the fighters, not even the bombers. The slow, ungainly patrol aircraft were marked for elimination from the first minutes of the war. At first glance, the decision made no sense. The PBY Catalina was slow, barely capable of 170 miles per hour. It was large, awkward, and poorly armed. It could not dogfight. It could not outrun anything. Against modern fighters, it seemed helpless. So why would Japanese planners devote precious time and ammunition to wiping out aircraft that appeared obsolete even before the war began? The answer would only become clear months later, as Japanese supply ships began disappearing at an alarming rate. By then, commanders would suspect that the Americans had unleashed some sort of secret weapon against their logistics network. They had. It was the Catalina, an unlikely legend. Today, when people list the great aircraft of World War II, the Catalina is rarely mentioned. The Hellcat is remembered for dominating the skies. The Corsair became a cinematic icon. The Flying Fortress and Superfortress defined strategic bombing. The Catalina usually earns a footnote, if it appears at all. Yet this aircraft would sink more enemy shipping than any other Allied plane in the Pacific. Black Cat squadrons alone destroyed over 400,000 tons of Japanese shipping, slowly starving isolated garrisons and collapsing Japan's ability to sustain its empire. It was present at virtually every major naval campaign. It was the first American aircraft to attack Japanese forces. It located enemy fleets, rescued thousands of airmen, and pioneered night attack tactics the enemy never successfully countered. And still, it remains forgotten. To understand how this happened, we have to step backward, not to 1941, but to an earlier era when aviation followed a very different logic, when the sea was the runway. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the fastest aircraft in the world were not land-based fighters. They were seaplanes. The Schneider Trophy races pushed aviation technology harder than any military program of the era. Nations invested heavily, knowing that speed records translated directly into combat advantage. Racing seaplanes exceeded 300 miles per hour at a time when most military fighters struggled to reach 200. The reason was simple. Land-based aircraft were limited by runways, short, rough grass strips rarely exceeding a few thousand feet. Seaplanes had no such restriction. They could accelerate across miles of open water, allowing designers to push wing loading and engine performance far beyond what land planes could safely manage. That advantage would disappear once long concrete runways became common. But for 2 critical decades, the sea represented freedom. Flying boats emerged from this environment with a different purpose. They were not racers. They were designed for range, endurance, and independence. By the early 1930s, massive flying boats were already crossing oceans, carrying passengers and mail between continents long before airports could support such routes. Military planners took notice. In a world where most airfields were primitive or non-existent, the ability to operate from any stretch of water offered enormous strategic flexibility. An aircraft that could patrol thousands of miles, land anywhere, and remain airborne for an entire day had value far beyond its speed. Designing the Catalina, the Consolidated Aircraft Corporation began work on what would become the PBY in 1933. By the time it entered service in 1936, critics already considered it outdated. Faster designs were appearing. 4-engine flying boats promised better performance. On paper, the Catalina looked like a compromise. In practice, it was almost perfectly balanced for the war it would fight. The Catalina's parasol wing sat high above the fuselage, giving the crew excellent downward visibility. ideal for spotting submarines, ships, or survivors. The wing's extreme aspect ratio made it long and narrow, maximizing fuel efficiency at low speeds. The aircraft's hull was divided into watertight compartments, allowing it to survive damage that would sink other aircraft. Inside, the Catalina was more than a cockpit. It was a place where crews lived. Missions routinely lasted 15 to 20 hours, sometimes longer. The crew moved through narrow compartments that included bunks and a tiny galley with electric hot plates. Food could be heated. Coffee could be brewed. These comforts were not luxuries. They were necessities for endurance. Observation blisters on each side gave gunners unmatched visibility. A tunnel gun defended the aircraft from below. Yet the most critical position aboard wasn't a gun at all. It was the flight engineer. Suspended between cockpit and wing, the engineer controlled nearly every system except the controls themselves. Fuel flow, engine temperatures, cooling flaps, electrical systems, and the retractable floats that served as wingtips in flight. With 1,750 gallons of fuel spread across multiple tanks, a single mistake could shut down both engines. Communication between pilots and engineer relied on a silent system of indicator lights, simple, reliable, and immune to combat damage or radio silence. This complexity allowed something no other aircraft could do: stay airborne. The threat Japan understood. Fully loaded, a Catalina could patrol for over 20 hours. It could search expanses of ocean no other aircraft could cover. It could land to rescue downed airmen in seas too rough for ships. It could operate from lagoons, reefs, or tenders hidden far from enemy intelligence. That endurance made it dangerous. A battleship could be repaired. An airfield could be rebuilt. But a patrol aircraft that could find fleets, track convoys, rescue pilots, and guide strikes represented a long-term threat to everything Japan planned to do after its opening blow. Japanese planners understood this. That is why the Catalinas were targeted first. They were not trying to win a battle. They were trying to blind the enemy. What they did not understand, what they could not yet know, was that the Catalina's war had only just begun. What made the PBY Catalina truly dangerous was not its weapons, but its freedom. While Japanese commanders could calculate the reach of American land-based aircraft by measuring distances from known airfields, the Catalina ignored those rules entirely. It did not need runways. It did not need permanent bases. If there was sheltered water, it could operate there. And if there was no base at all, the U.S. Navy could simply bring one with it. Seaplane tenders became the Catalina's secret weapon. Converted destroyers, cruisers, and purpose-built tenders could anchor in hidden lagoons, remote bays, or behind jungle-covered islands. Fuel, bombs, torpedoes, spare parts, even full engine changes, could be conducted afloat. A Catalina squadron might launch from one location one night, strike enemy shipping hundreds of miles away, then relocate before dawn. Japanese intelligence never knew where the next attack would originate. The former aircraft carrier USS Langley ended her service life as a seaplane tender, supporting Catalina operations far from conventional bases. The USS Tangier could sustain an entire squadron, providing fuel, ammunition, medical care, and heavy maintenance. By war's end, the U.S. Navy operated at least 14 dedicated seaplane tenders, each capable of supporting between 12 and 30 Catalinas. Any lagoon could become an airfield overnight. This mobility shattered Japanese planning assumptions. A convoy that appeared safe one evening could be attacked the next by aircraft that had not existed in that region the day before. And from the very first hours of the war, the Catalina proved why it had been marked for destruction. The first shots of the Pacific War. 1 hour before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, a Catalina crew was already at war. Ensign William Tanner and his crew were patrolling off Oahu when they spotted an unusual shape in the water, a Japanese midget submarine attempting to penetrate the harbor defenses. The Catalina attacked immediately, dropping depth charges to mark the target. Moments later, the destroyer USS Ward opened fire and sank the submarine. The first American shots of World War II against Japan were fired because a Catalina crew had found the enemy. When the main attack began, Japanese pilots carried explicit orders: destroy the PBYs. The results were devastating. Of 81 aircraft, 73 were destroyed on the ground. Yet the Japanese failed to finish the job. Within hours, the 8 surviving Catalinas were airborne, searching for the Japanese fleet. They flew until fuel exhaustion, landed, refueled, and launched again. As America reeled from defeat after defeat in the early months of the war, the Catalina remained one of the few aircraft capable of striking back. But the early fighting also revealed a brutal truth. Learning the hard way. In daylight, the Catalina was vulnerable. In the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, PBYs attempting conventional bombing missions were massacred by Japanese fighters. Their slow speed and poor maneuverability made them easy targets. High-altitude bombing proved useless. Bombs dropped from 10,000 feet missed agile ships entirely. Yet even in disaster, lessons emerged. On December 10, 1941, Chief Bosun Earl D. Payne, manning a bow gun during a fighter attack, shot down a Japanese aircraft. It became the first confirmed U.S. Navy air-to-air kill against Japan. More importantly, crews learned that Catalinas could defend themselves when used correctly. The real breakthrough came on December 27, 1941. 6 Catalinas launched from Ambon to attack Japanese shipping at Holo Island. 4 were shot down. The mission was considered a failure. But 2 crews ignored doctrine and dove toward their targets, releasing bombs at low altitude. They scored no direct hits, but the near misses forced ships to scatter and revealed something critical. Low-level attacks might work. If the Catalina could not survive by speed, it could survive by surprise, preferably at night. Midway, the turning point. Before those tactics could be refined, the Catalina would play a decisive role in the most important naval battle of the war. On June 3, 1942, Ensign Jack Reed and his crew were 14 hours into a patrol northwest of Midway. Flying low through scattered clouds, Reed spotted what appeared to be a rain squall on the horizon. As they approached, the squall resolved into ships, dozens of them. For aircraft carriers, the Japanese invasion fleet had been found exactly where American codebreakers predicted it would be. Reed's contact report electrified the Pacific Fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz, already maneuvering his carriers into position, now had confirmation. That night, for Catalinas equipped with torpedoes launched from Midway, flying by moonlight and radar, they found the fleet again. At 1:15 a.m. on June 4th, Ensign Alan Rothenberg released a torpedo that struck the oiler Akabano Maru. It was the only successful American aerial torpedo hit of the entire Battle of Midway. The damage itself was minor. The psychological impact was not. Japanese commanders had not expected torpedo attacks from flying boats at night. They had no effective defense against such tactics. How many Catalinas were out there in the darkness? How many torpedoes might come without warning? Midway marked the beginning of the end for Japanese expansion and the beginning of the Catalina's deadliest phase, becoming the Black Cats. By late 1942, innovative commanders began exploiting the Catalina's limitations as strengths. The aircraft was slow, but at night, slow meant quiet. Flying at 70 knots, just 50 feet above the water, a Catalina was nearly invisible and almost silent until directly overhead. Crews painted their aircraft flat black using improvised mixtures of lampblack and soap. Flame dampers were added to exhausts to eliminate engine glow. The Black Cats were born. As Japanese forces struggled to supply Guadalcanal, they turned to night convoys, the so-called Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers ran supplies under cover of darkness, escaping before dawn. For a time, it worked. Then the Black Cats arrived. Flying at mast height in total darkness, Catalinas attacked without warning. The first sign of danger was often an explosion among tightly packed ships. Crews carried mixed weapon loads, 100-pound bombs for barges, 500-pound bombs for transports, and occasionally torpedoes. But their greatest weapon was persistence. Squadrons like VP-11 developed relay tactics. One Catalina would attack, forcing ships to scatter. As the convoy regrouped, another aircraft struck from a different direction. The attacks continued all night. No rest. No escape. In a single month, Black Cat Squadron sank 41,000 tons of shipping and damaged another 43,000 tons. Japanese logistics began to collapse. Destroyers burned fuel at unsustainable rates. Barges and small craft were annihilated. Entire garrisons began to starve. Japanese intelligence became convinced the Americans had deployed a new type of fast, heavily armed night bomber. They were wrong. The terror haunting their supply lines was a flying boat designed in 1933. By 1943, the PBY Catalina had become a weapon the Japanese could not counter. The Pacific War was ultimately a war of logistics, and the Catalina attacked that weakness relentlessly. Black Cat squadrons flew night missions at extremely low altitude, striking supply convoys moving under cover of darkness. Their slow speed became an advantage. Flying low and quiet, they appeared without warning, attacked repeatedly through the night, and vanished before dawn. These operations shattered Japanese supply lines. Entire garrisons were starved of food, fuel, and ammunition. Destroyers pressed into supply duty burned fuel faster than Japan could replace it. By mid-1943, Japanese commanders were convinced the Americans were using a secret new night bomber, never realizing they were being hunted by an aircraft designed a decade earlier. The Catalina's impact went far beyond combat. It located the Japanese fleet at Midway, discovered the intact Zero fighter that changed air combat tactics, and performed some of the most daring rescues of the war. In August 1945, a Catalina landed in heavy seas to rescue survivors of the USS Indianapolis, saving 56 men by lashing them to its wings when the aircraft could no longer take off. More than 3,000 airmen were rescued by Catalinas during the war. They sank enemy submarines, strangled supply routes, and stayed airborne for over 20 hours when no other aircraft could. The Catalina was slow, awkward, and outdated, but it was present at nearly every major naval campaign in the Pacific. It did not win fame through dogfights or bombing raids. It won by endurance, persistence, and adaptability. That is why the Japanese feared it, and why history should remember it.